So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Marbury v. Madison case. This started back around 1800 when Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the presidential election. And just before Thomas Jefferson became president, the Adams administration, along with the Senate, had passed a law that created a whole bunch of new judges. And the whole point of this was to get the Adams administration to appoint new judges that would then be judges during the Jefferson administration. But the way the act was timed, the Jefferson administration would have to deliver the appointments to those new judges. And when Jefferson became president, he didn't do that. And then one of the people who should have been appointed a judge was Marbury, and Marbury sued James Madison. So Marbury is the plaintiff, Madison is the defendant, Marbury v. Madison. Marbury sued James Madison as the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson to force Madison to make him a judge. Well, so the questions the court had to decide was, did the plaintiff have the right to be appointed a judge under this law? And can they sue for this? And in the end, what the court decided was that while Madison should have delivered the appointments, the law itself was actually unconstitutional. You don't really need to know the reasons why it was unconstitutional. What matters here is that this was the first time the Supreme Court had ruled a law unconstitutional. So therefore, the court was establishing for itself the precedent of judicial review, that they could in fact overturn a law passed by Congress and signed by the president. And they could say that that law was unconstitutional. And that's why this case is really important in judicial history, because it establishes the precedent of judicial review in the United States. Okay, so the second big case you need to know for the test at the end of the year is McCulloch v. Maryland, which happened in 1816. You don't have to memorize the year, but this is the second big case. In the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, in 1816, Congress had established a national bank, and there was a branch of the bank in Maryland. Maryland decided they wanted to tax the bank. The bank, however, refused to pay the tax. So then it goes to the Supreme Court. And the court has to decide, first, does Congress have the authority to establish a national bank? And did Maryland have the authority to tax the bank? The conclusion was a unanimous decision by the court that under the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause of the Constitution, the Congress did have the authority to establish a national bank. And since they had the authority to establish a national bank under the supremacy clause, Maryland could not tax the bank. Because obviously if Maryland can tax the bank, it has the power to potentially even destroy the bank, which would give it more power over the national government. And that would kind of go against the supremacy clause, which says that the national government is supreme. So again, little review real quick. McCulloch v. Maryland established that the necessary and proper clause gives Congress the ability to do things that are not explicitly stated or enumerated in the Constitution. So we have implied powers, necessary and proper, or elastic clause there, allowing the Congress to establish a national bank. The next case we're going to discuss is the Schenck v. United States case of 1919. Now, again, generally, you do not need to memorize years for these cases, but this is a case where you do need to know it's a World War I case. It comes out of World War I. During World War I, there were some socialists in the United States who were against the U.S. involvement in the war, and so they wanted to protest the draft. Drafting people into the army. And so they distributed some leaflets or flyers arguing that people should ignore the draft and refuse to join the military. Then Schenck was arrested under the 1917 Espionage Act for going against the United States and supporting our enemies during war. So this goes to the Supreme Court, and the question was, did Schenck's free speech rights get violated by the Espionage Act? The court eventually ruled that the Espionage Act was legitimate and that Schenck's conviction was legitimate. that even though Schenck was in fact exercising free speech, during wartime, Congress would have extra authority to prevent what was called a clear and present danger to the United States. So this establishes a precedent further that had already been established, that First Amendment free speech rights are not absolute, that there can be some limits on that free speech, and in this case, during war especially, courts would defer more to Congress in establishing rules around speech. So Schenck's conviction was upheld, and his free speech was legitimately limited according to the Supreme Court in this decision, Schenck v. United States. Another war case you need to know about is Korematsu v. United States. The Schenck case was in World War I, but Korematsu is in World War II. And what happens in this case is America, of course, was attacked by the Japanese on December 7th, 1941. That leads to the United States entering World War II. Just a few months later, February of 1942, Congress and President Roosevelt passed a law that ordered Americans of Japanese descent into internment camps, basically prison camps. And Korematsu refused to go, but then was eventually arrested, and he appealed his arrest. It went to the Supreme Court, and his issue was that he had not committed a crime prior to not going to this prison camp. So the question was, did the President and Congress have the authority to restrict the freedom of Japanese Americans just because they happen to be Japanese Americans? And the Supreme Court ruled that there was a military necessity during war to keep the United States safe, and therefore Congress did have the power to do whatever was necessary to keep the United States safe, and that included imprisoning Japanese Americans who had not done anything wrong. So again, this expanded the idea that during war, Congress has extra authorities or can push things a little farther, and that courts should defer to Congress a little bit more during times of war in order to keep the United States safe. So Schenck v. United States and Korematsu v. United States both go to this idea that during war, people's rights can be curtailed or cut back a little bit more, and courts would go ahead and defer to that.